Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Chemical Safety at Work. I'm Mel.
And I'm Pat. Today we're tackling a topic that might seem a little bit counterintuitive at first: safety issues with empty chemical containers and gas cylinders.
That's right. So you'd think that once chemicals are gone, the dangers are gone too, right?
Yeah, but not quite. Even when a chemical container or gas cylinder looks empty, it can still pose serious hazards. Things like fire, explosion, toxic poisoning, and even environmental contamination.
And these risks aren't just theoretical. So there's been incidents where empty containers have caused fires or even explosions. And today we're going to look at why these dangers exist and what the regulations say about managing these so-called empty containers.
We'll also be sharing best practices for handling, storage, disposing of these containers so that you can keep your workplace safe and compliant.
So let's start by breaking down what the problem is. What makes an empty container or cylinder dangerous?
Well, first off, they're not actually empty. Even if the main contents have been removed, residues of the chemical, whether it's liquid, gas or solid, can still be present. And in some cases, those residues are just as hazardous as a full container.
Exactly. So if you think about flammable liquids, for example, when you've poured out a drum of, say, acetone, you'll still have some vapours left inside. And these vapours can ignite just as easily as if the drum was full.
Yeah, the same goes for gas cylinders. Even when they're empty, there's often still a small amount of gas left inside, enough to cause a fire or explosion if the conditions are right. There's been a bunch of examples of this. In 2011, there was a fire and explosion in a Queensland junkyard where someone began cutting a supposedly empty gas bottle with a cutting torch. The residual gas in the cylinder ignited, and that led to an explosion that caused injuries and extensive damage to property.
Right, so that brings us to a key point. So whether it's a chemical container or a gas cylinder, they have to be treated as if they're full and until they've been properly decontaminated or gas-freed.
And this isn't just best practice, it's actually a regulatory requirement. For example, under Australian Standard AS 1940 for flammable liquids, empty flammable containers have to keep their hazard labels until they're completely decontaminated. And they need to be stored as if they're still full, including keeping them away from ignition sources.
Exactly. And the same rules apply for other dangerous goods classes too. So, for example, toxics and corrosive substances, they have their own standards that outline how to handle and store these so-called empty containers safely.
Yeah, with corrosives, even a tiny residue can damage skin, corrode metal, or even cause toxic vapours. So empty containers need to be securely closed, stored properly, and clearly identified until they're decontaminated.
That's right. And decontamination can mean different things depending on the chemical. So for some, it's as simple as a thorough wash with water. For others, you might need to do a triple rinse with a specific solvent or a neutralising agent.
According to Safe Work Australia's Managing Risks of Hazardous Chemicals in the Workplace Code of Practice, used or empty gas cylinders should be treated with the same precautions as full ones. This means keeping the valve closed, storing them upright, and ensuring they're isolated from incompatible substances.
So let's talk a little bit more about what to do with these containers and cylinders, especially when they're no longer needed. Pat, what are some good storage practices?
Well, first off, empty chemical containers should be segregated, just like full ones. And that means keeping flammables away from oxidizers, acids away from bases, and so on.
Yep. And the storage area should be cool, well ventilated, away from heat or direct sunlight. So that way you're minimising the risk of any leftover vapours igniting or residuals reacting.
For gas cylinders, it's also important to keep them upright, secured and isolated from incompatible gases. And remember, Class 2.1 flammable gases need to be separated by at least 3 metres from Class 2.3 toxic gases or Class 2.2 oxidising gases.
So when it comes to disposal, this is where things can get a bit tricky. So you actually can't just throw out these containers in the regular bin, and you can't just leave them out in a scrapyard either.
No, definitely not. For flammable liquids, the containers have to be cleaned and then crushed or punctured just to make sure that they can't be reused. With toxic and corrosive containers, it's a similar process, cleaning, neutralising, and making sure that any potential for reuse is eliminated.
And there's a big emphasis on following the right disposal procedures for your local area. So some states or councils have specific requirements, so you should always check with your local waste authority or EPA.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's also a good idea to return gas cylinders to the supplier whenever that's possible. Most suppliers do have a take-back program for their empty cylinders, and it's usually the safest option.
Cool. So, Pat, what are the key takeaways here?
I think the main one is empty doesn't mean safe.
Yeah.
You need to manage these containers and cylinders just like they're full until they've been properly treated. Follow the Australian standards, keep them in a safe, isolated storage area, and use the right disposal methods.
And remember, when in doubt, always refer to the safety data sheet, SDS, or consult with a dangerous goods expert. So it's always better to be overly cautious than to have an incident.
Absolutely. We've actually got a free ebook on chemical storage safety that goes into a lot more detail about these topics. So you can check that out on our website if you do want to dive a bit deeper.
Yeah, we've also got our segregation charts as well, which people may find handy. Thanks, Pat. So that's a wrap for today's episode. Thank you for tuning in, everyone. Stay safe out there, and don't forget, empty containers can still be dangerous.
That's right. We'll see you next time on Chemical Safety at Work. Take care.